We are pleased to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Bettina Palazzo, who has been researching, teaching, and consulting in business ethics for over 25 years. A pioneer in the field, she helped build the business ethics practice at KPMG Germany in the 90s. She has worked with companies from automotive to pharmaceuticals and telecommunications, and with non-profits like UN organizations, hospitals, and NGOs. Dr. Palazzo is especially interested in the gray zones of ethical decision-making and the psychological dynamics that lead to unethical behavior. She has worked extensively on developing ethical leadership and speak-up culture, as well as the prevention of sexual harassment in companies. She says, "For me, ethics is a superpower, because ethical businesses make people happy, more creative, and more productive."
In 4 Minuten geht's los, oder jetzt? Okay. Yes, very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Benjamin, for introducing us why normal people do unethical things. And now we will look at why leaders do unethical things and what we can learn from it. So here we have 3 men, and the question is, what do these 3 men have in common? Well, they all failed the ethical leadership test, which is they thought because of their power position, they don't have to follow the same rules as the common people. You probably recognize Boris Johnson, who threw lavish parties while the commonly people were stuck in lockdown, or Novak Djokovic, who thought that COVID-19 rules are not really valid for him. Less famous is the last person in the team. It's Bill Michael, the ex-chairman of KPMG UK. What happened to him? Well, he was speaking in a town hall meeting, and he said some pretty disrespectful stuff about the young consultants who were moaning about the heavy workload they were subjected to. And he also said that nobody needs unconscious bias training, it's stupid. Unfortunately to him, the meeting was leaked, and as the jargon in the industry goes, he was consulted to leave. Yeah. And when we look at these situations from the outside, we always ask ourselves, what were they thinking? For us, it is clear that leaders are always under ethical scrutiny and that they get punished mercilessly if they think just because of their position of power, the rules for everybody else don't apply to them. But on the other hand side, if you think about it, in just like a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, these situations would not have created such an outcry and moral indignation. So why all of a sudden top executives are forced to be good, as the motto of this conference goes, which I like really, really very much. And I see 2 explanations for this. On the one hand side, the public tolerance for bad behavior in the C-suite went dramatically down. We can see this in this annual survey that PwC runs every year. And for the first time in 2018, there were more CEOs fired not for bad financial performance, but for ethical lapses like corruption, sexual misconduct, involvement in fraud, insider trading. And at the same time, leaders have never really learned, so how do you behave as an ethical leader? And it's actually not so easy unless you're a natural. It is something that needs some training and understanding. So let's explore together why it's obviously so difficult for leaders to be an ethical role model. Here we find a first explanation from a famous experiment from the 70s, the Stanford Prison experiment. Here, the researchers took a couple of male average students and decided by the flip of a coin who would be a prisoner and who would be a guard. And then they put them into a mock prison in the Stanford Department of Psychology to find out what's going on in prisons, why do we have so much violence, what's going on. And they wanted to run this role play for 2 weeks. they had to stop it after 6 days. So why? Well, it turned out that the guards abused the power that they had all of a sudden, and they mistreated the prisoners by waking them up in the middle of the night and letting them do push-ups. You see it on the picture. They put paper bags on their heads, and they put even one person in solitary confinement. So the lesson is that if you give people power all of a sudden and they're not prepared for it and you don't control it, chances are very high that they will abuse their power. Today, we know much more about power and what it does to your brain, thanks to neuroscience, like Benjamin already said. So we know now that if you get power, you have something like your brain changes and you have something like a power high. And the effect of this power high is not very ethics friendly. So power junkies they lose their empathy, they get less empathetic, they behave impulsive and disrespectful, they come up with very clever excuses for bad behavior, and they think they're entitled to more than others. There's even one exciting study where they put people all of a sudden in a position of power, and it turns out that they suddenly thought that their subordinates were sexually attracted to them. And it even happened to men and women, that they suddenly saw people more as objects than as individuals. A similar study was done with brownies. Here, the setup was that people had to share brownies in teams, and when they randomly put one person in the position of the leader, guess what? All of a sudden, because the person was in a power position, they took more brownies, even though before getting into this power position, they divided them fairly. And I still remember in one of my very first projects with a big department store company, the people in my workshops told me the story about one manager in the sweets department. And he walked in every morning into this department, and he took one piece of chocolate from the display every morning. Do you think this manager realized that he was being a bad role model? Probably not. Do you think that he deserved getting his daily dose of chocolate? Hell yes. But this is not the only danger to ethics power. There are other ethical challenges for leaders. The first one is overconfidence bias. Well, leaders, of course, they need to be confident. Otherwise, they wouldn't be leaders. You can say, oh, maybe we should do that. I don't really know. No, you have to show up confident, say, this is how we do it. This is how we get there. The problem, of course, is that if you get into this dynamic that you have increasingly a tendency that you're always right and you always know best. And that's not a good setup if you need to ask some self-critical questions about your ethics from time to time. And this gets enhanced by the fact that many leaders are already equipped with a very positive self-image. Then they get uncritical feedback from their followers, and they surround themselves with yes men. So asking some critical questions is increasingly difficult. But guess what? We are all a work in progress, and we need this kind of feedback. And it gets even worse by another fancy scientific term, by moral superiority bias. In general, most people think that they are smarter and more hardworking than other people, even though, of course, statistically, it's not really possible. And it seems to be even more the case with how we judge our moral qualities, that we think we are more ethical than others, which was found out by another fun research study where they asked British prison inmates, and they were convinced that they were more honest, trustworthy, and compassionate than the average people. If you ever lived with roommates, you might remember that we were always convinced that we did the dishes more often and cleaned up more than the others, right? Yeah. So with all of these biases together, we often end up with this formula. So we have power poisoning plus overconfidence bias plus superiority bias. And this, of course, leads to a higher probability that leaders commit ethical missteps. But that's not the whole story. So we need to add another thing. When we look at recent corporate scandals, it turns out that most of the time, people in the organization knew about the problems for at least a year. So the big question is, why didn't they say anything? So imagine you are a manager, you're in the middle of a very stressful project, and one of your coworkers comes to you with an ethical concern. Would you say, oh, thank you for speaking up, I want to hear your critical opinion? Not really. Most people, when they get confronted with negative feedback on their ethics, get defensive and angry. And this is actually why giving feedback, speaking up on ethics is scary for the giver of the feedback, because they know it's not good for the relationship with the other person, especially if the other person happens to be a boss. And it's scary for the receiver of the feedback. And here I have another fun scientific term for you. It's called moral identity threat, which means that we instantly react with defensiveness if our ethics are questioned. Yeah. Here, so you remember our manager from the sweets department. Do you think the people in his team told him that he shouldn't take this chocolate every day because it's bad role modeling? Of course not. Yeah. Do you think the team went to work with joy and motivation and was never tempted to also take some chocolates? Of course not. People are hardwired for injustices and they don't like it. It kills motivation, and it's an invitation and a great justification. We heard about justification before, to imitate. Bad role modeling is an invitation to imitation. So this brings us to the dangerous formula, all of these biases together, of power poisoning, overconfidence bias, moral superiority bias, moral identity threat, and then you have your ticking time bomb in your organization. So what can we learn for this? What can companies and compliance do to work against these dangers of power for ethical leadership and creating a culture of integrity? So let's explore. I have 3 ideas here for you. The first one is create checks and balances against abuse of power. The second, work on the ethical leadership skills of your managers. And the third, regularly pop your leaders' power bubble. You already get a feel this is something that goes beyond compliance. This is something that needs an overall cultural change in the company, and as compliance, you need to at least team up with your HR. So power in itself is not a bad thing. It's something that helps you to get things done. It only gets difficult if it goes too much in the direction of having your way and having power over people. But we have a choice here, so why not get inspired by Spider-Man, who said that great power comes with great responsibility. So instead of using power as something to get your way, we can decide to try to use power as something to look out for people. And of course here, this is not something that an individual leader can do alone. The forces of the context are too strong. So I was thinking about what can companies in compliance do on a systemic level to better manage power. So the first thing is that you need to work on an overall culture, because we know from research that organizations where you have a high frequency of abuse of power, like sexual harassment, they are characterized by a culture of fear and hyper competitiveness. So what you need to do, you need to work towards a culture of psychological safety and appreciation. Then you need to include integrity in your recruitment and in your promoting. This used to be very controversial because, of course, it's very hard to judge the moral character of a person. But today we have new personality tests that use bias as a proxy for ethics, because we know from research if you have prejudice, you have the tendency to treat your team badly and to also have less productive teams. And then you need to set expectations. So how do we want to deal with power? What is the expectation to our manager? And then you need to enforce it in the evaluation system. Here you can use metrics. Of course, you need to measure it. And what can we measure to find out if a leader is abusing power? We can look at turnover, sick leave, the health of the team, and the diversity of the team. One indicator, for instance, for a toxic environment is if you have a high turnover of female leaders. So what I would suggest is if a manager has a repeating or high level of burnout, depression, sick leave, in his team, then he should have a date with compliance and or HR and explain this. Just knowing that this might happen will change behavior. Yeah. And then finally, of course, you can't expect that your managers will stay humble and grounded if the rest of the organization is celebrating status and power with symbols like lavish salaries, huge bonuses, or other perks like corner offices or the famous parking spot for executives. Yeah. This, of course, is a pretty tough change in culture, but I'm convinced if you do this, you can prevent misconduct long before it happens. And this brings me to the second ethical leadership power move, which is working on your leadership's ethical fitness. And here I envision 4 elements for ethical leadership fitness. The first one is ethical blindness awareness, which means showing leaders how they influence the ethics of their followers, how they can become ethically blind through forces like time and performance pressure, and what to do about it. The second move is ethics action from the top. It is often not clear for managers how they can bring ethics into their daily decisions and communications with their teams in words and in deed. So here they need tools and guidelines. The third power move is our ethical dilemma drills, which means we can prepare depending where somebody works. If you're in HR, you have different but dilemmas that you know will sooner or later happen in your work life than if you're working in procurement. So you can prepare this and in cold blood before these things happen, because in the heat of the moment, making these tough decisions and saying the right things is very hard. And the fourth ethical fitness move is the ethics dialogue, which means how can leaders create a speak-up culture where they know how to listen well so people feel that it's safe and worthwhile to give their honest feedback, but also for themselves to know how they can speak up without creating defensiveness. And the third way to fight against the perils of power is to regularly pop your leader's power bubble. Because if we are always in our bubble and we are not confronted what's going on in real life, if we are not aware of what privilege we have, and then we get kind of lost and think, stay in touch with the real world. So how can you do this? So here I have 3 ideas. The first one is reverse mentoring, which means that junior coworker coaches and challenges a senior leader, which is very effective for keeping them grounded and also for perspective taking. Or corporate volunteering. Why not let managers work in a hospital or with homeless people, so to keep them humble and see how difficult life can be for other people? And yeah, you can really be creative there, whatever works to keep your leaders in touch with the base. The legendary CEO of Avis, Robert Townsend, for instance, once a week he went to work at the counter of his car rental to know what's going on at his people. Or a former boss of mine, he always made a point when he rented a car to take a cheap one to remember what it feels like if you're not the king of the road. Or another example I learned at a client of mine at a Swiss railroad company. Here, the top management team joins the cleaning team once a year to swipe the platforms. Yeah. So whatever works there, these are magic antidotes against power intoxication. The good news is if you shift your compliance away from only prevention into a leadership skill, then you achieve much more than just prevention, because we know from research that in the teams of ethical leaders, not only do they act more ethically themselves and address critical issues before they escalate, they are also more happy and more productive. And this is actually what compliance is always looking for, to be seen as a real business asset that people want to be a part of. And this turn to seeing compliance as a leadership skill can help you to go into this direction and also have more fun as a compliance person.